What if Hulk was cursed by the gods and Kratos had to stop him? Section 1. The Norse gods had always collected monsters. It was their oldest habit, older than Odin's throne, older than the first frost that crept across Midgard's newborn soil. They gathered catastrophes the way lesser beings gathered gold. They named them, chained them, pointed them at enemies, and called it wisdom. Fenrir, Jormungandr, the wolf and the serpent, bound and weaponized and waiting for the day their leashes would finally snap. The Allfather understood something that most kings never learned. The most useful tool was never a sword. It was something that wanted to destroy, something that needed only direction. So when the tear appeared in Yggdrasil's lowest branch, that sickly luminescent wound in the fabric between realms, a bleeding green light that had no name in any runic language, Odin did not recoil. He watched from the high seat of Hlidskjalf, his single eye burning with cold recognition, and he smiled the way a chess player smiles when the board arranges itself beyond expectation. Something had come through. Something extraordinary. The impact registered across every realm simultaneously. In Midgard, the ground split. Not cracked, split as though the earth itself flinched away from the thing that struck it. A crater 40 meters wide scorched the ancient forest northeast of the Lake of Nine, and trees that had stood since before human memory were simply gone. Not felled, not burned, but erased in a ring of superheated air and gamma-irradiated soil that glowed faintly even as the snow tried to reclaim it. The birds did not return to that forest for 3 days. The wolves fled south and did not stop running. The Hulk lay in the center of the crater for approximately 4 seconds. Then he got up. He rose slowly, not from pain. Pain was a distant academic concept to something like him, but from disorientation. The emerald musculature across his shoulders rolled as he straightened to his full height, and his eyes, green as the wound in the sky above him, swept the alien landscape with the particular fury of a being who has learned that confusion and rage are interchangeable currencies. The sky was wrong. Too many stars arranged in constellations that Banner's buried cartography could not name. The cold was wrong, deeper than any cold he'd felt, carrying weight, carrying intent, as though the temperature itself was alive and hostile. The trees that hadn't been destroyed by his arrival were massive, ancient, their bark carved with symbols that pulsed faintly with a light that had nothing to do with bioluminescence and everything to do with forces that predated human science by several millennia. He didn't know where he was. He knew with absolute animal certainty that it was going to be a problem. The roar that left his chest was not a battle cry. It was something older than language, a declaration of existence against a universe that kept trying to reduce him to nothing. It rolled across the frozen landscape and shook snow from branches half a mile away, and somewhere deep beneath the green, beneath the gamma radiation and the boundless rage, Bruce Banner pressed his palms against the inside of his own skull and screamed without making a sound. Where are we? What happened? The lab, the experiment, Yggdrasil, that name surfacing from somewhere, a translation file he'd opened once during a consultation with Stark about Norse mythology and energy signatures. Yggdrasil, the world tree, the axis of Norse cosmology. The Hulk did not care about Norse cosmology. The Hulk cared that something was watching him. He felt it before he saw it. A presence above, vast, ancient, singular, pressing against the edges of his awareness with the particular weight of something that had been observing catastrophes for centuries and found them merely interesting. When he looked up, the sky was empty, but the feeling remained, that patient, calculating attention, and Banner's consciousness flickered with a warning he couldn't push through the green to the surface. Don't. Whatever this is, don't. But we need to think. We need to. The runes hit him like a second impact. They came from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Burning symbols that materialized in the air around him, in a ring 30 feet across. Ancient script that blazed with blue-gold light and smelled of ozone and iron and something else. Something beneath chemistry, something that Banner's entire scientific framework had no category for. They contracted, fast, faster than he could react in the first disoriented seconds after dimensional transit. And when they struck his skin, they didn't burn. They sank in, like brands applied not to flesh, but to something deeper, to the mechanism of his rage itself. The Hulk screamed, not from pain, from something worse than pain, from the sudden, terrible sense of direction, as though the formless fury that had always been his and his alone, that had always belonged to the animal need to survive, had been aimed, recalibrated, given a target by something external that had no right to reach inside him, no right to touch the engine of his existence and redirect it like a river rerouted by a dam. Banner felt it too, and his silent scream changed register from warning to despair. Something had just put a leash on the Hulk, and somewhere above the nine realms, in the high seat where all of creation was visible to a single ancient eye, Odin settled back and turned his attention northwest, toward a certain Spartan's lodge near the base of a certain mountain. And the smile that crossed the Allfather's face was the smile of a man who had just loaded a weapon he had no intention of firing himself. That was always the elegant part. You didn't point monsters at gods directly. You pointed monsters at other monsters, and then you watched what happened to both. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Kratos had learned to read silence the way other men read scripture. He had lived long enough, through the screaming courts of Olympus, through the ash-gray years of Sparta, through the slow and deliberate reconstruction of himself in the cold Norse air, to understand that silence was never empty. Silence had texture. It had weight. The silence of a forest after a predator passed through felt different from the silence of a forest that had simply run out of living things to make noise. The silence around the Lake of Nine that morning was the second kind, and Kratos registered it the moment he stepped outside. He stood at the threshold of the lodge, Leviathan axe absent from his hand. He had been chopping wood, the mundane violence of domestic labor, the kind of work he had come to value precisely because it destroyed nothing that mattered. The axe remained buried in the splitting stump. His hands, scarred white against the ash-gray of his skin, were still. His eyes moved northwest, tracking something he could not yet see but could feel in the particular way that men who have killed gods develop a sensitivity to divine interference, like pressure behind the eyes. It's like the air thickening half a degree before a storm that hasn't broken yet. The ground had shuddered 20 minutes ago. Not an earthquake. He knew earthquakes. This was an impact. Something had fallen, or arrived, or both simultaneously. You feel that? Atreus appeared beside him, younger than the weight he carried suggested, his bow already in hand with the instinct of a boy raised in permanent readiness. His breath clouded in the cold air. I felt it. Kratos retrieved the axe from the stump with one hand, the motion economical, practiced. Stay close. Mimir's severed head swung gently from Kratos' belt as they moved through the tree line. The former ambassador's eyes already scanning the runic disturbance that lingered in the upper atmosphere, like smoke after a fire, visible only to those who knew what old magic looked like when it burned. Brother, Mimir said, and his voice carried the particular careful neutrality of a man choosing each word as though diffusing something. I don't wish to alarm either of you, but those runes above the impact site, the binding script in the upper configuration, that's not wild magic. That's not residual Yggdrasil energy. That's deliberate. That's constructed. Odin, Kratos said, not a question. Odin, Mimir confirmed, and managed to make a single word carry the full weight of a man who had spent centuries in the Allfather's service, watching him ruin extraordinary things for ordinary reasons. Homai in the configuration? I've seen that specific runic array once before. Decades ago. He used a variant of it on Fenrir before the binding. It's not a cage, you understand. It's not meant to contain. It's a harness. It takes whatever is inside and makes it go where you point it. Atreus slowed. He's already been here. Before we even knew, the All-Father has had one eye on this realm longer than your grandfather was born, boy. Mimir's tone was grim. Whatever came through that rift, Odin was watching for it. Perhaps waiting for it. Perhaps, and this is the thought that troubles me most, perhaps he helped it happen. Kratos said nothing. He had stopped at the edge of the tree line. Before them, the crater stretched wide and deep, its edges blackened. The snow within it already turning to steam from residual heat that had no natural source. The gamma-irradiated soil pulsed with faint green luminescence that painted the surrounding tree trunks in sickly light. And at the center of it all, facing away from them with his back a wall of green muscle and barely contained destruction, stood something that did not belong in any of the 9 realms. The Hulk had not yet turned, but his shoulders were moving. That slow, terrible rhythm of a chest heaving with breath too large for the surrounding air to comfortably hold. The runes were still visible on his skin, faintly, blue-gold against green, Odin's script written into the Gamma Beast's biology like graffiti carved into something ancient and sacred. "What is it?" Atreus whispered. "Only I do not know." Kratos studied the figure with the cold assessment of a man who had measured divine threats since before the boy's bloodline existed. Height, considerable, comparable to a small giant. Mass, extraordinary, beyond anything human. The way it held itself, that was the detail that mattered. Not the posture of a creature at rest. The posture of a creature fighting against something internal, shoulders rigid, hands clenched, the specific tension of a being at war with itself. He had worn that posture for most of his adult life. He recognized it immediately. Above them, unseen, Odin's working completed its final stage. The runic harness pulsed once, a single deep throb that resonated through the crater like a struck bell. And the Hulk's head turned. Not gradually, not with curiosity, and with the sudden mechanical certainty of a compass needle snapping to magnetic north. The green eyes found Kratos across the 40 meters of scorched earth between them, and whatever had been fighting for control behind those eyes, whatever small, exhausted, brilliant human consciousness had been pressing against the inside of that massive skull, went quiet, not calmed, displaced. The Allfather's script was elegant in its brutality. It did not destroy Banner. It simply moved him aside, the way you move furniture to clear a floor before a fight. The rage that remained was not the Hulk's own rage, not the deep, earned, survival-driven fury that had carried Bruce Banner through decades of trauma and transformation. It was Odin's rage, curated, refined, pointed with a precision that the raw emotion could never have managed alone. And it was pointed directly at the god of war. "Boy!" Kratos' voice was low, steady, carrying the specific calm of a man who has already accepted that the next several minutes will be catastrophic. "Move behind the trees." Atreus didn't move. "I can help." That was not a suggestion. The Hulk took his first step forward, and the crater's edge cracked beneath his foot like the ground itself was reconsidering its structural commitments. The green luminescence of the soil reflected off his skin and turned the Norse twilight into something alien, something that belonged to no mythology these realms had ever produced. Mimir exhaled slowly. "Well, I've been decapitated, soul-trapped in a magic bag, and used as a lantern in Helheim." He paused. "I believe this may still be worse." The Hulk roared, and the 9 realms held their breath. The first strike arrived before the roar finished echoing. That was the thing about the Hulk that no amount of preparation could fully account for. Not the strength, not the invulnerability, not even the rage that powered both. It was the speed, the catastrophic, physics-mocking velocity of something that massive moving that fast, crossing 40 meters of scorched Norse earth in a single bound that turned the remaining snow in the crater into a horizontal blizzard and left footprint craters 6 inches deep in frozen ground that had resisted glaciers. Kratos had fought gods. He had fought titans whose shoulders scraped the sky and whose footsteps swallowed armies. He had learned through blood and repetition that the most dangerous opponents were never the ones who telegraphed their power with slow, theatrical menace. They were the ones who were already hitting you before your body had finished processing the threat. He got the Leviathan axe up in time to redirect rather than absorb. A critical distinction. The Hulk's right fist connected with the axe's head at an angle that sent Kratos sideways rather than backward, the force translating through the weapon's haft into his shoulders and spine with enough violence to crack the ice beneath his boots in a 6-foot radius. He skidded, found his footing in the way of a man who has been staggered by divine force so many times that recovery has become instinctual, Weight low, axe repositioned, eyes never leaving the target. The Hulk didn't pause to assess. He was already swinging again. The second strike Kratos ducked, feeling the displaced air from the Hulk's fist rake across his scalp like a physical thing. And he drove the axe's pommel into the green figure's ribs with everything his Spartan-born, divinity-forged body could produce. The impact was enormous, against anything else in the Nine Realms. Baldur, the Troll Kings, even the echoes of Thor he'd measured himself against in strategy, it would have been a fight-ending blow. Against the Hulk, it accomplished something more modest. It got his attention. The green eyes snapped down to Kratos with an expression that was not quite pain and not quite surprise, but somewhere between them. The face of a being registering that something had hit it with enough force to matter, which was a category that did not normally include things the size of a man. So Kratos used the half-second of recalibration to create distance, rolling left across the crater's edge and coming up in the tree line with the axe drawn back. He threw it in the same motion, not at the Hulk's chest, not at anything vital, but at the runes. The Leviathan axe was not merely a weapon, it was Faye's weapon. Jotnar forged, inscribed with runes that predated the current age, and carried within them a cold so fundamental it was less a temperature than a principle. It struck the blue-gold script on the Hulk's left shoulder, and the collision of magical systems produced a sound like a bell cracking. A single dissonant tone that rang across the crater and made Atreus, watching from behind a tree 40 meters back, press his palms to his ears. The Hulk flinched. Not much. A centimeter of recoil in the left shoulder, out of a fractional dimming of the runic glow, a half-second where the green eyes blinked and something flickered behind them that wasn't Odin's directed rage. Something confused, something human, something exhausted. Then the runes flared back to full intensity and it was gone. Interesting, Kratos noted, calling the axe back to his hand with the practiced mental reach that still felt, after years, like flexing a muscle he hadn't known he possessed before Faye gave it to him. The cold disrupts the binding. Not enough, but it disrupts it. He filed the observation away in the part of his mind that had been filing tactical observations since before most of these trees were saplings, and then he focused entirely on not dying in the next 15 seconds. The Hulk's fighting style, Kratos assessed as he moved, was not the brawling chaos it superficially resembled. Beneath the rage, even Odin's redirected, curated rage, there was something structural, patterns, weight distribution that suggested not training, but instinct honed through thousands of conflicts against opponents who range from human to cosmic in scale. The Hulk knew on a level below conscious thought how to manage the geometry of a fight. He cut off lateral movement. He pressured the space between Kratos and the tree line where Atreus waited. He varied timing between strikes in ways that prevented pure rhythm reading. This was not a mindless beast. This was a warrior who happened to currently have someone else's goals. Kratos dropped under a haymaker that would have removed his head from his shoulders and drove his shoulder into the Hulk's midsection. Not expecting to move him, using the contact as a brace to plant his feet and shove upward into a throw that leveraged the differential in their centers of gravity. The Hulk went up, not far, not gracefully, but up. Enough for Kratos to create the space he needed. Enough for him to put 3 trees between himself and the next inevitable impact. The Hulk came down on the trees instead. They did not survive the introduction. 3 ancient Norse pines, each one 30 meters tall, each one older than the current age of gods, simply ceased to be vertical when the Hulk landed on them. The sound was enormous, a chain of cracks like the world's largest spine breaking, and the shockwave of displaced air and debris hit Kratos like a horizontal wave and carried him another 10 feet before he got his feet under him again. He was bleeding. Small lacerations from flying debris. Nothing structural, nothing that would slow him. He cataloged the damage with the clinical detachment of a man who had learned long ago that feeling pain during a fight was a luxury reserved for survivors. Kratos, Atreus's voice from his right, further than expected. The boy had been smart enough to move when the trees went. The runes on its skin, they're brighter when it's angry. When you slowed it down, they dimmed. I know, Kratos was already moving again. So we need to calm it down. Boy, he barely paused. Look at it. A beat of silence as Atreus looked at the Hulk, now rising from the wreckage of three ancient trees, with splinters the size of spears caught across his shoulders, and an expression of absolute, divinely amplified fury that made the surrounding air feel pressurized. That turned every instinct toward retreat and survival, and the immediate reconsideration of all prior life choices. Right, Atreus said quietly. Different approach. The Hulk found Kratos again with those terrible green eyes in charge. And in the high seat above all realms, Odin watched with the patient satisfaction of a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as designed, which for those who knew the Allfather, was precisely when to start worrying about what the plan actually was. The fight changed when the Hulk hesitated. Not much. Not in any way that would have been visible to an observer without Kratos' particular education in the architecture of violence. It lasted perhaps a quarter of a second, a fractional stall in the follow-through of a strike that should have driven Kratos 6 feet into the frozen earth, the fist pulling at the last possible instant with a restraint that was not Odin's. The blow still hit. It struck Kratos across the left side of his chest and sent him into the base of an oak wide enough to have sheltered a giant, and the oak lost the argument comprehensively, splitting at its root and toppling into the darkness of the deeper forest behind it. Kratos went down with it, breathing through the impact, cataloging the damage. 2 ribs compromised, possibly cracked. Nothing that would stop him. And when he looked up through the settling debris, the Hulk was standing 8 feet away. Not closing, standing. The green eyes were doing something Kratos had not seen them do since this began. They were moving, not with the locked, magnetic certainty of Odin's directed rage, with something more complicated, something searching, something that swept the surrounding destruction with an expression that was not fury and not recognition, but something stranded painfully between them. The runic script on his skin was fluctuating, brightening, dimming, brightening again. A rhythm that matched, Kratos realized, the visible tension cycling through the massive frame, as though something inside was fighting the harness for control impulses, spending itself in bursts, losing ground each time, but refusing to stop trying. The half-second stretched. Kratos did not move. He had learned, through decades of being the thing other people were afraid of, that there were moments in a fight that were not actually about the fight. Moments where the violence paused, not from weakness, but from the tremendous effort of something trying to be more than what it had been made into. And he had stood in those moments himself more times than he could count. He knew what they cost. He knew how briefly they lasted before the thing you'd been made into reasserted itself and swallowed the thing you were trying to be. He used the half-second to look. Actually look, without the tactical filter that reduced everything to threat assessment and countermeasure. At the face behind the fury, at the eyes that were green but not uniformly green, that had depth to them, layering, the particular exhausted complexity of a consciousness that had been fighting a war inside its own skull for longer than anyone should have to fight anything. There was a man in there, badly positioned, badly outnumbered by his own biology, but present, pushing against the inside of a prison that happened to be shaped like himself. I know you, Kratos thought. And the thought arrived with a weight he had not expected. The runes flared. The hesitation ended. The Hulk came forward again, and Kratos met him, not retreating, not creating distance, but holding ground with the Leviathan axe across his body, in a guard position, and taking the blow across the weapon's haft with both arms braced behind it. The force drove him back 3 feet through frozen soil, heels cutting furrows. But he held. Barely. The impact sang through his arms and settled in his spine as a deep, resonant ache that he would feel for days. He held. And while he held, while his face was inches from the Hulk's, and the green eyes burned with Odin's stolen rage, and something underneath it that burned differently, he said, quietly without theater. In the tone he used with Atreus when he wanted to reach the boy beneath the soldier's composure, he had trained him to maintain. I know what it is to be a weapon that cannot put itself down. The runes flickered. Not much. A single pulse of dimming, half a breath of wavering, before they surged back to full intensity, and the Hulk pressed harder against the axe, and Kratos' boots cut deeper into the earth. But it had happened. Mimir, watching from Kratos' belt with the particular attentiveness of a severed head, for whom observation was the primary remaining contribution to any situation, noted it carefully and stored it with the instinct of a man who had survived centuries in the Allfather's court by understanding which small things were actually large. Kratos broke the clinch with a pivot and a shove that redirected the Hulk's momentum sideways, creating the space he needed to breathe and recalibrate. He circled left, axe still raised, watching the fluctuating runes with the tactical attention he'd previously spent on the strikes themselves. Mimir, low, controlled. Already thinking it, brother. The head's voice was careful, choosing words the way a man navigates a minefield. Quickly, but with absolute attention to placement. The cold disrupts the binding. You observe that. But I'm watching something else. When the creature's attention fragments, when it's fighting itself, the runes dim. Odin's harness runs on directed rage. Undirected rage, internal conflict, the creature's own consciousness pushing back. It creates interference in the script, like static across a signal. So the man inside weakens the curse. The man inside is the weakness in the curse. Odin didn't account for, or perhaps couldn't fully suppress, the degree to which the creature's nature is fundamentally divided. He harnessed the rage. But the rage has a passenger, and the passenger is... Mimir paused, something like reluctant admiration entering his tone. Stubborn, extraordinarily, unreasonably stubborn. Kratos looked at the Hulk, who had stopped again. Another of those fractional pauses, another internal war briefly surfacing, and whose massive hands were, for just a moment, not fists. Open hands, at his sides. The gesture of a man trying to demonstrate he means no harm, even while every divine instruction wired into his nervous system screamed otherwise. Banner. Kratos understood without needing to understand the specific name, the specific history, the specific architecture of that particular suffering. He understood the shape of it, the particular degradation of being afraid of yourself. The knowledge that the hands that had held the people you loved were the same hands that had destroyed things you could never rebuild. The exhausting, endless work of trying to be more than the worst version of yourself, while the worst version waited with infinite patience for you to slip. He had been the monster that killed his wife and child. He had worn their ashes on his skin for years as penance and reminder and monument to what unchecked fury cost. He looked at the Hulk, at Banner's open hands lasting one more impossible second before the runes flared and the fist returned. And he felt something he had not expected to feel in this fight. Recognition, not sympathy. Sympathy was a luxury that the next incoming strike did not afford him. But recognition, the cold, precise acknowledgement that the thing across from him was suffering in a language he was fluent in, settled into his chest alongside the cracked ribs and changed something fundamental about his approach. This was not a monster to be destroyed. This was a man to be reached. The problem, as the Hulk's next strike removed an entire section of tree line and the shockwave knocked Atreus from his feet 50 meters away, was that reaching him and surviving the attempt were goals of spectacular, mutual incompatibility. Kratos rolled to his feet, spat blood, and began to think harder. Freya arrived the way she always arrived, uninvited, perfectly timed, and carrying information that made everything more complicated. She came through the tree line from the east on silent feet, veneer magic trailing behind her like smoke from a doused fire, her green eyes sweeping the devastation of the last 10 minutes with the practiced assessment of a woman who had cataloged destruction across multiple lifetimes in multiple wars and had developed the particular composure of someone who has learned that visible alarm is a currency best spent sparingly. She took in the flattened trees, the crater, the gamma-irradiated soil still pulsing its alien green against the Norse twilight. Atreus picking himself up from the snow with an arrow already knocked. Kratos bleeding from a dozen minor wounds and standing with the Leviathan axe raised against something that dwarfed every enemy these woods had previously produced. She stopped beside Atreus, studied the Hulk for a long and careful moment, and said, "I see Odin has been busy." "You knew." Atreus's voice carried the specific controlled anger of a boy who had grown up learning that the gods around him withheld information as reflexively as they breathed. I suspected, Freya's jaw tightened. There is a difference. I came when suspicion became certainty. Her eyes moved to Kratos, who had not acknowledged her arrival because he was currently occupied with not being killed, which Freya accepted as a reasonable prioritization. Spartan, you need to stop trying to defeat it. I am aware, Kratos said through his teeth. We're redirecting another strike with the axe and using the momentum to pivot the Hulk sideways into the remaining standing trees, which immediately became formerly standing trees. The direct approach has limitations. The direct approach will kill you. Eventually. She moved forward, veneer energy gathering at her fingertips. Not attack magic, something more delicate, something that read the runes on the Hulk's skin from a distance, with the sensitivity of a woman who had spent years as the goddess of both love and war, and understood that the most dangerous things were always the ones built from both. What she read made her go still in a way that had nothing to do with calm. Freya, Mimir's voice was careful. What is it? She turned to look at him. And the expression on her face was something Mimir had seen perhaps twice in all his centuries of service to the Allfather. Not fear exactly, but its sophisticated older sibling. The expression of someone who has just understood the full scope of a plan they had previously only seen a piece of. It is not just a weapon, she said. It is a key. She said it again when Kratos had created enough distance to listen. A temporary truce with gravity and momentum. The Hulk paused in another of those internal war hesitations that were becoming the only reliable interruptions in his assault. Freya spoke quickly, in the efficient cadence of someone aware that pauses in catastrophes rarely lasted long enough. The creature's power, the energy inside it, is not natural to these realms. She gestured at the glowing soil, the green luminescence that had no rune name in any language of the Nine Realms. Odin has been studying the rift since it opened. That energy, whatever it is, resonates with Yggdrasil's roots in a specific way, a destructive way, like a frequency that cracks stone, you understand? The wrong note breaks the glass, Mimir offered. Yes, Freya's voice was flat and urgent. Odin does not simply want to use this creature against you, Kratos. That is secondary. The primary purpose, what he has been building towards since the rift appeared, is to drive the creature to Yggdrasil's base, to release that energy directly against the World Tree's roots. She paused. At sufficient rage levels, amplified by the runic harness, the gamma force, his scholars called it that, gamma, and I heard it in his war councils, would not merely damage Yggdrasil. The silence that followed had weight. It would trigger Ragnarok, Atreus said. Not a question. His voice had gone very quiet in the way it did when he was doing rapid, unwilling calculations about his own destiny. Ahead of prophecy, before anyone is ready, before he stopped. Before Atreus has positioned the pieces he needs, Mimir finished, his tone bleak. Before Loki has done what Loki is meant to do, Odin wants Ragnarok on his terms, controlled, a collapse he survives because he engineered the timing. He made a sound of profound, exhausted disgust. Of course he does. Of course that's what this is. Kratos had not spoken. He stood with his axe at his side and his eyes on the Hulk, who was fighting the runic harness again. That terrible, visible war. Open hands and clenched hands alternating as Banner pushed and the curse pushed back. Watching the man inside the monster spend himself in bursts against a divine chain he had no framework to understand, fighting with nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to be entirely erased. How far is Yggdrasil's base from this position? Kratos said. At the speed that thing moves, Freya calculated grimly. If the harness fully suppresses the creature's internal resistance, if it stops fighting itself, and Odin points it directly north, 20 minutes, perhaps less. Then we have 20 minutes to break the curse. Kratos! Freya's voice carried the particular gentleness of someone delivering news to a man who survives bad news through momentum and does not do well when stopped by it. The runic array Odin used, I recognize the base script. It is the same family of binding magic he used to tie Fenrir, to tie me. The last two words arrived with a flatness that contained decades of a particular kind of fury. I could not break my own binding. You understand what I am telling you. You broke it eventually, Atreus said, with help, with time, with a specific counterworking that required components I do not have in a forest in Midgard with. She glanced at the Hulk, whose fluctuating runes were stabilizing again, the internal war losing ground as the harness recalibrated. Approximately 20 minutes. She looked at Kratos. There is one way. One component that could disrupt the bindings sufficiently to give the creature's own resistance the foothold it needs to break through. Kratos waited. The runestone anchor, Freya said. Every binding of this scale requires a physical anchor, a carved stone that holds the master script. Destroy the anchor and the harness fractures, the creature's internal resistance, which is. She paused, studying the Hulk with something that moved briefly across her face and resembled, if not sympathy, then at least recognition of a particular kind of captivity. Considerable, given what I am observing, would do the rest. Where is the anchor? Freya's expression answered before her words did. He would not leave it somewhere it could be easily reached, Mimir said, his voice arriving at the conclusion with the weariness of a man who has spent centuries watching the Allfather architect inconveniences. Somewhere protected, somewhere neither you nor the creature could reach without. He stopped, reconsidered. Oh, that clever, miserable, one-eyed. Helheim, Freya said. The word landed in the cold air like a stone dropped in the still water, spreading outward in implications, each one colder than the last. Helheim, the realm of the dishonored dead, where Kratos had walked once before at tremendous cost, where the cold was not merely temperature but philosophy, where the boat of Hresvelgr waited and the Hellwalkers moved through frost that had never known warmth and never would. Kratos looked north, where Yggdrasil waited, and 20 minutes were already becoming 19. He looked at the Hulk, who had found him again with those terrible green eyes, the internal war lost for now, Odin's rage back at full amplitude, and pointed with divine precision at the god of war. He looked at Atreus. Stay with him, Kratos said. Do not engage. Keep him occupied. Keep him moving. Do not let him move north. He held the boy's gaze for a moment that carried more than words had room for. You know how to survive. Use it. Atreus nodded once. The soldier's composure. Underneath it, something that was simply his son, trusting him. Kratos turned toward the darker trees, toward the path that led to Helheim's gate, and began to run. Behind him the Hulk roared, and the sound of it chased him through the forest like a second shadow, vast and green and full of a suffering that had no language in any realm, waiting to be heard by someone who finally understood it. Atreus had faced gods. He wanted to be clear about that. Not in the way of boasting, because Kratos had spent years methodically removing boasting from his character the way a careful hand removes splinters, but in the way of context. He had stood in Baldur's path. He had looked at Magni and Modi, Thor's sons, with their hammers and their casual divine violence, and he had not flinched. He had walked through Helheim as a boy and come back carrying the weight of a name, Loki, that rewrote everything he thought he understood about his own existence. He had faced things that belonged to the upper registers of the Nine Realms threat hierarchy and survived each of them through some combination of skill, preparation, stubbornness, and his father's intervention at the critical moment. His father was not here, and the thing in front of him made Baldur look like a minor inconvenience. He kept moving. That was the first principle, his father's principle, as drilled into him across years of training with the patience of a man who understood that repetition was the only honest teacher. A stationary target is a gift to your enemy. Move. Always move. Create the problem of your location. He circled wide, using the tree line, keeping 40 meters between himself and the Hulk, with the awareness that 40 meters was a distance this particular enemy covered in approximately 1.5 seconds, and therefore represented a comfort margin of purely psychological value. The Hulk tracked him. That was both the problem and, Atreus realized as he moved and watched and thought, with the rapid tactical intelligence that was perhaps the most purely his own of all his inheritances, a potential resource. The runic harness had given the Hulk a primary target, Kratos, and with Kratos gone, Aturin, the curse was recalibrating. He could see it in the way the green eyes swept the tree line with something slightly less than absolute certainty. Odin had pointed this weapon at the god of war specifically. Without that fixed target, the harness was running a secondary protocol: destroy what remains, move north. But the transition between directives created a fractional window of reduced intensity in the runic script. Small, maybe 3 seconds per cycle as the harness reset its aim. Atreus had done more with less. He stepped out of the tree line, deliberately. Hands raised, bow lowered, no arrows knocked. The specific body language of de-escalation that he'd learned not from his father, who had not had many occasions to practice it, but from the quieter lessons embedded in his mother's stories about approaching things that were afraid of themselves. The Hulk stopped. Not the full mechanical stop of Odin's curse locating a target. Something more uncertain. The pause of a being whose primary directive had momentarily lost its object and whose own nature was filling the gap with something other than destruction. The green eyes found Atreus, and the runic script pulsed once, evaluating. The boy was not a threat. The curse knew this, filed it, began to look past him toward the north, toward Yggdrasil. "Hey," Atreus said. The Hulk looked back. It was not a word of power. It carried no Jotnar magic, no runic authority, no divine compulsion. It was simply a boy's voice in a destroyed forest, and something about its ordinariness, its complete absence of the divine theater that had composed every other sound in the Hulk's experience of the 9 realms so far, created a different kind of interruption than the Leviathan axes, cold, or Kratos' strikes. Those disruptions were physical. This one was something the harness hadn't been designed to filter, because Odin, in all his centuries of wisdom and scheming, had apparently not accounted for someone simply talking. The runic script dimmed. Not much, but measurably. Atreus could see it, the blue gold losing a degree of intensity. And in the space that created, something moved behind the green eyes that wasn't rage and wasn't Odin's direction and was unmistakably trying to surface. Atreus took 3 steps forward, controlled, deliberate, watching the runes the way his father had taught him to watch an enemy's hands. The thing that would tell you what was coming before the rest of the body committed to it. "I know you're in there," he said, not loudly. The tone he used when Kratos went somewhere unreachable inside himself, and Atreus needed to find the way back to him without triggering the defenses that had been built specifically to prevent being reached. "I know it's not you doing this. I know someone else is steering." He paused, chose the next words carefully. "I know what that feels like. Having something inside you that isn't yours, that people are afraid of, that you didn't ask for." The Hulk had not moved. The runes were cycling, dimming when Atreus spoke, flaring as the harness compensated, dimming again, a rhythm like a tide, like breathing. Atreus felt something stir in his own chest. Not magic exactly, or not only magic. Something older than the specific mechanics of his Jotnar inheritance. Something that lived in the part of him that carried his mother's capacity for connection alongside his father's capacity for survival. It rose in response to what he was seeing, not to the monster, not to the divine threat assessment his training defaulted to, but to the suffering underneath it, visible, inarticulate, tremendous suffering, expressing itself in the only language available to it, which was destruction, because everything else had been taken away. He thought about his father standing in the crater, not moving, while those terrible green eyes searched for something they couldn't name. He thought about what his father had said, quiet, uncharacteristic, arriving from somewhere beneath the Spartan stone. "I know what it is to be a weapon that cannot put itself down." He thought about names, about what it meant to carry one you didn't choose. Atreus, Loki, both true, both incomplete. "My name is Atreus," he said. "I'm also Loki. I didn't choose either of those things, and both of them want something from me that I haven't figured out how to give yet." He was 10 meters away now, close enough to see the individual runes on the green skin, close enough to see the fluctuation in them was synchronized with the rhythm of his voice. What's your name? Not, not the other thing. The one underneath. The Hulk's expression did something extraordinary. It didn't soften. The gamma-amplified divine rage didn't permit softening. The harness didn't allow for the full architecture of a human expression to assemble itself on those features. But something in the eyes changed. A focusing, an orientation inward rather than outward, as though the question had reached through all the divine interference and the gamma radiation and the bottomless rage and found a very tired man sitting in the dark of his own skull. And the very tired man had heard it and had turned toward it the way people turn toward their own name called across a crowded room. The runes went dim, not a pulse, not a cycle, a sustained dimming. 3 seconds, 4, 5. The longest banner had held ground against the harness since it was applied. Atreus reached out with the Jotnar instinct he was still learning to trust. Watched the one that Angerboda had begun to teach him and that he was completing through improvisation, and he pressed, not against the Hulk, not against the rage, but toward the consciousness beneath it. Not a push, an offering of contact, a hand extended into darkness without knowing what would take it. Something took it, not completely, not with the clarity of full communication. The harness was still running, still fighting, and it surged back with renewed intensity that snapped the runes back to full brightness and rocked the Hulk's attention away from Atreus and toward the north. Toward Yggdrasil, the secondary directive reasserting with urgent force. The contact broke. Whatever had briefly reached back retreated behind Green and Rage and Odin's script. But in the half-second before it did, Atreus felt something arrive in his chest with the particular clarity of things that come from outside yourself and land with the authority of truth. Not words, an impression, the shape of a feeling rather than its specific content. Please. Atreus lowered his raised hands and knocked an arrow. Not at the Hulk, at the ground in front of him, a barrier of shock arrows that would buy seconds rather than harm, and spoke over his shoulder to Mimir, who had been watching from where Kratos had set him against a tree root before departing. He's still in there, Atreus said. Banner, all of him. He's aware of everything that's happening, and he can't stop any of it. His voice was steady, but something moved behind it. He asked me for help. Mimir was quiet for a moment. Then your father needs to move faster. The Hulk turned north. Atreus stepped into his path. Hey, he said again. We're not done. Helheim did not welcome visitors. It had never been designed to. The realm of the dishonored dead was not a punishment in the conventional sense. Not a place of active torment, not a divine court dispensing suffering with theatrical intention. It was something colder and more honest than that. It was simply a place where warmth did not exist, had never existed, and would not exist regardless of what you brought with you. The fires of Muspelheim burned in the living world, the heat of Kratos' divine blood, the friction of his rage, the biological insistence of a body that had survived things nobody should. None of it mattered here. Helheim took the measure of what you carried and subtracted warmth from it as a matter of philosophical principle. And what remained after that subtraction was the truth of you, stripped of comfort, offered back with the realm's characteristic indifference. Kratos had been here before. He moved through it faster this time. The bridge of the Hraesvelgr stretched across the frozen void in both directions without apparent terminus. Its ancient stonework rimmed with ice that had been accumulating since before the current age of gods began. Hellwalkers moved across it in the shuffling, purposeless patterns of the dishonored dead, not attacking yet, registering his presence with the slow mechanical attention of things that had exchanged volition for persistence. He moved through them with the Leviathan axe in minimal engagement, each strike calculated to clear his path rather than commit to a battle that would cost him minutes he did not have. It's 19 minutes, Freya had said. He had already spent 4 getting here. The bridge's midpoint opened onto the platform where Hraesvelgr's gate stood, and beyond it, the deeper realm, the territory where Odin's influence would have been exercised, where the All-Father would have placed the anchor because Odin understood, with the strategic intelligence of a being who had spent millennia outthinking enemies, that the most secure vault was one your opponent could access, but not easily, not impossible. Odin knew Kratos was capable, had always known it, factored it into every calculation, but costly, delayed. And delay, when you had already pointed a gamma-powered weapon at the World Tree with a 20-minute window, was sufficient. He planned for me to come here, Kratos realized. I'm moving through the gate with the axe, clearing a Hellwalker from his path, in a motion so practiced it barely registered as action. He planned for me to leave the creature. He planned for the boy to be alone with it. The thought arrived cold and did not leave. The deeper realm was darker than the bridge. Darkness not as absence of light, but as active presence. The specific blackness of Helheim's interior that pressed against the eyes with faint luminescence of frost and bone light, the dead illuminating themselves with the pale glow of their own remnant existence. Kratos moved through it with the Spartan's gift for orientation in hostile terrain. No landmarks, no runic guides, navigating by the particular pull of old magic that the Chaos Blades had always been sensitive to. Enema, their chains warm against his forearms, with the borrowed heat of Olympian fire that Helheim could diminish, but not entirely extinguish. He felt the anchor before he saw it. It was the specific feeling of Odin's magic. He had learned its signature through Freya's descriptions and his own encounters with the Allfather's workings. That combination of immense intelligence and absolute cold intent. Magic that always felt like something thinking while it worked. It pulled from the northwest corner of the Deep Realm's first chamber, behind a defensive arrangement that Kratos assessed in the first second of encountering it, with the tactical brevity of a man who no longer had patience for elaborate assessment. 3 Hellwalkers of the larger variant, the ones carrying the absorbed echoes of warriors, retaining muscle memory of combat even in death. A runic ward across the chamber entrance that would require either the specific counter key or brute magical disruption. And beyond them, on a natural shelf of Helheim stone that had been smoothed and inscribed with exacting precision, the runestone anchor, roughly the size of a human skull, carved from black rock that pulsed with blue-gold light, recognizable from the script on the Hulk's skin. Kratos did not slow down. He threw the Leviathan axe at the runic ward first, the cold of the Jotnar-forged weapon hitting the ward's magical matrix with the same dissonant crack it had produced against the harness itself. Faye's work resonating against Odin's work with fundamental incompatibility that fractured the ward in a single strike. The ward collapsed. He recalled the axe mid-stride and hit the first Hellwalker at full momentum, the impact carrying both of them through the chamber entrance, and he was already processing the second and third as he dealt with the first, the blades of chaos coming off his back with their chains singing against the dead air. The chaos blades were faster than the axe, less precise, less cold, more fire and fury. Olympian instruments that had no natural place in the Norse cosmos and therefore operated in it with a kind of alien authority. Their fire an affront to Helheim's foundational coldness that the realm's defenders could not easily adapt to. The second Hellwalker met the left blade at full extension. The third met both at once, and the Chaos Blade's chains wrapped and pulled with the specific brutality they had been forged to deliver, and in 11 seconds from the ward's collapse, the chamber was clear. Kratos stood before the runestone anchor. He picked it up. It fought him, not physically, not with the kinetic force of a weapon, but with the deep magical resistance of a working that understood being destroyed and objected to it on fundamental principle. The blue-gold script crawled across his hands as he held it, probing for vulnerability with the Allfather's intelligence embedded in its design, looking for a way into his divine biology that it could exploit. He felt it reach toward the old wounds, toward the places where gods had hurt him, toward the ash-white scars and the deeper ones that left no visible mark, and try to find purchase in them. He had spent years making those wounds into armor. He closed both hands around the anchor and pressed inward with everything the Spartan body could produce. Not magic, not divine energy, simply the brute, magnificent violence of a being who had torn the heads from gods with his hands. And the runestone cracked. Not easily. It fought him through 3 long seconds that left his palms bleeding and his vision darkening at the edges from the magical blowback. But cracks were progress. Cracks were irrevocable. He bore down harder, through the pain and the blowback, and the All-Father's intelligence pushing back with cold, calculating force, and thought about a green-eyed man pressing his palms against the inside of his own skull and screaming without sound, spending himself in bursts against the divine chain he had not asked for and could not name. The anchor shattered. The blue-gold light died, and the silence that followed was the specific silence of a working ending. Not the silence of Helheim's cold indifference, but the silence of something that had been making noise at a frequency below hearing, suddenly stopping, and the absence of it was loud. Kratos stood in the chamber with blood running from his hands and pieces of the Allfather's work scattered across Helheim's stone, and above him, through realms of distance and divine architecture, he felt rather than heard the moment the harness on the Hulk's skin fractured. He turned and ran. Behind him, Helheim's deep realm stirred, drawn by the disruption of the anchor's destruction, by the violence of its unmaking, by the specific vibration of Odin's work being broken by human hands. The Hellwalkers turned toward the chamber entrance with renewed attention, and from somewhere in the upper reaches of the realm, carried on the dead cold air with the particular resonance of something ancient and vast, registering an insult to its domain, Chris Velger screamed. Kratos did not slow down. He had a son holding a god-cursed monster in place with nothing but words and stubbornness, and 15 seconds of Helheim between him and the surface, and 14 minutes, if Freya's estimate had been generous, before the harness's fracture either freed Banner or failed entirely and sent an unanchored, fully amplified Hulk toward the World Tree without direction or restraint. He moved through the screaming dark at the speed of a man who has burned every permissible margin and is running on the specific fuel of someone who cannot afford to be too late again. Not again. The fracture hit the Hulk like a second impact. Atreus felt it happen before he saw it. A resonant pulse that moved through the ground beneath his feet and up through his bones with the specific frequency of old magic breaking. Junar's senses registering the destruction of the anchor in Helheim as a vibration in the fabric of the working itself. He had been running lateral patterns for 11 minutes, keeping himself between the Hulk and the northern tree line, with shock arrows and sonic arrows in every piece of misdirection his training had given him, spending each tool with the careful economy of someone who knew exactly how finite his resources were. The arrows slowed, the shouts redirected. The connection he had briefly established with Banner's consciousness, he had returned to twice more. Brief, costly contacts that had bought seconds each time and left him feeling hollowed out in the specific way that using the Jotnar gifts beyond their comfortable range always did. He had bought his father enough time. The fracture bloomed across the Hulk's skin in a visible wave, the blue-gold runes cracking outward from a central point on his left shoulder, the exact location where the Leviathan axe had first struck and left its cold signature. As though Faye's weapon had planted a seed of disruption that the anchor's destruction had finally allowed to flower. The cracks spread, the script fragmented, and through the gaps in Odin's working, something surged upward with the desperate velocity of a consciousness that had been holding its breath underwater for an hour and had just found the surface. Banner came up swinging, not literally. His body was still the Hulk's body, still 3 meters of gamma-irradiated muscle and impossible mass, still running on the biological engine of limitless rage. But the eyes changed. The locked magnetic certainty of Odin's directed fury crumbled away, and what replaced it was something rawer and more complicated: disorientation, horror, the specific expression of a man who has just regained awareness mid-catastrophe and is processing the gap between his last conscious memory and the present moment by reading the destruction surrounding him. The devastated forest, the craters, the green luminescence still pulsing from the soil. The boy standing in front of him with an arrow knocked and an expression of exhausted, determined relief. The Hulk stumbled, not from impact, from the internal reconfiguration, a Banner's consciousness wrestling for coordination with a body that had been running on pure, divine amplified autopilot for the better part of an hour. He went down on one knee, massive hands hitting the frozen ground and leaving craters, and his breathing changed, became the ragged, hyperventilating cadence of someone surfacing from a nightmare into a reality that was not necessarily better. Atreus lowered the bow. Banner, he said, not a question, a greeting. The green eyes found him and held, and for the first time since the Hulk had landed in the Nine Realms, they contained something that was purely, entirely Bruce Banner. Brilliant and terrified and grieving in the way of a man counting the damage and knowing the final number before he finishes. The boy, a voice said, vast and ruined and barely recognizable as language, when emerging from the Hulk's chest with the specific effort of a man speaking a language through a body not optimally designed for it. You, talk to me. You heard me, Atreus said. I always, the voice broke, reorganized. I always hear everything. Neither of them heard Odin arrive. That was the point. The All-Father did not announce himself with the operatic thunder that lesser gods required to feel significant. He appeared at the crater's northern edge the way certainty appears, without transition, simply present, having not been there, and then being there, his ravens settling into the broken branches above him with the comfortable familiarity of things that had been watching this location for hours. He stood in his traveling clothes, one-eyed and ancient and utterly unremarkable in appearance. And the staff in his hand rested against the frozen ground with the casual authority of a man who has never in his life needed to demonstrate power physically because everything within his reach already knew the cost of requiring the demonstration. He looked at the Hulk, kneeling in the crater with the fractured runes still guttering on his skin. He looked at Atreus. Something moved across the All-Father's face. Not anger, because anger was reactive, and Odin was never reactive. Assessment. The rapid, cold recalibration of a mind that operated 17 steps ahead of every other mind in the room and had just discovered that the board had moved without its permission. Loki, he said pleasantly. You've been busy. Atreus positioned himself between Odin and the Hulk with an instinct that was half training and half something older than training. You're not taking him. Taking him. Odin repeated the phrase with the gentle curiosity of someone encountering a charming misconception. He came to us, boy, a gift from a realm I've been studying for decades. A realm with energy signatures that make your mother's Vonner magic look like a child's candle. I simply, he tilted his head, improved the delivery. You used him to try to trigger Ragnarok. I used him to accelerate an inevitability. The distinction seemed genuinely important to him. Ragnarok happens. It is written. I have spent centuries attempting to find a version of it in which I survive, in which something worth preserving survives. In what I found this morning represented the most viable path I have encountered. He glanced at the broken runes on the Hulk's skin with the expression of a craftsman assessing damaged work. And someone has complicated that path considerably. He looked toward the eastern tree line. Hello, Spartan. Kratos emerged from the trees still bleeding from both hands. The chaos blades retracted, the Leviathan axe drawn. He had come up from Helheim's gate at a dead run and not slowed, moving through the forest with the single-minded momentum of a man who had burned the last of his permissible margins and was running on something beyond adrenaline, beyond divine endurance, on the specific fuel of arriving and finding his son still standing. He assessed the scene in the first second. Atreus unhurt. Banner surfaced, kneeling, fractured runes. In Odin at the crater's edge, calm, staff grounded, ravens watching. He positioned himself beside Atreus. You destroyed my anchor, Odin said. Not accusatory, observational. In Helheim, that required, I'll admit it, more efficiency than I had allocated for. I gave you 20 minutes. A faint pause. You used 13. I was motivated, Kratos said. Yes. Odin studied him. You usually are. It's your most predictable quality and your most useful one. He shifted the staff slightly, a motion so small it should have meant nothing, and the air around the crater changed. Not temperature, not weather, potential, the specific atmospheric change of a being of immense power, shifting from passive to something adjacent to active. The ravens above ruffled their feathers simultaneously. The anchor is gone. The primary harness is fractured. I acknowledge these as facts. He looked at the Hulk. But the creature's power remains. Its energy signature remains. And a fractured harness, Spartan, is not the same as no harness. Kratos went still. Mimir at his belt spoke very quietly. He's right, brother. Broken doesn't mean dead. If the All-Father still has threads of the working, Odin moved the staff. Not much. A precise, economic gesture that contained more runic authority in its execution than most gods could produce with a full ceremony and an hour of preparation. The fractured runes on the Hulk's skin, the broken, guttering remnants of the anchor's destruction, flared. Banner's surfaced consciousness had approximately 1 second of warning. Then Odin pulled on the remaining threads of the harness, and the rage flooded back. Not with the clean directional precision of the intact working, not the controlled weapon the Allfather had constructed, but something worse. Something broken and massive and undirected. A dam destroyed rather than opened. The Gamma Fury running without the anchor's organizing structure, amplified beyond its previous ceiling by the desperation of the secondary working and the accumulated pressure of Banner's own resistance pushing against it. The Hulk rose, not to his feet. He erupted. The thunderclap shockwave of both fists hitting the ground simultaneously radiated outward from the crater's center and hit everything within 50 meters with the indiscriminate violence of a natural disaster. Kratos driven back into the tree line. Atreus lifted entirely from his feet and carried 10 meters before the trees stopped him. Odin himself taking 2 deliberate steps backward with the staff absorbing the force, his expression shifting for the first time from calculation to something that acknowledged it had miscalculated. Not the force. He had expected the force. The direction. The Hulk turned. And he did not turn north, toward Yggdrasil, toward the World Tree, and Odin's accelerated Ragnarok. The fractured harness, broken and unanchored, had lost its directional matrix. The rage was enormous. Larger than before, unceilinged. The amplification without its organizing structure, running past every previous limit like a river that has destroyed its own banks. But rage without direction was not Odin's weapon. It was the Hulk's. And the Hulk's rage returned to itself, returned to Banner's own furious grief and the accumulated horror of standing in a destroyed forest in a world he did not know with the evidence of what he had done, scattered across 40 meters of ruined Norse landscape. That rage had its own direction. It turned toward the one-eyed man at the crater's edge. Odin looked at what was coming for him. The staff rose, and for the first time in the long centuries of the Allfather's existence, something crossed his ancient, calculating face that did not belong to strategy or assessment or the 17 steps ahead certainty that had always been his primary weapon. Something that looked for just a moment like the honest recognition that he had made an error. Odin did not run. Running was for beings whose primary asset was physical, for things that survive through speed or strength or the biological insistence of a body that refused to stop. Odin survived through something older and less dignified than courage, and more reliable than either speed or strength. He survived through the comprehensive, unsentimental understanding that every situation contained a viable exit if you were willing to pay its specific price, and through the absolute willingness to pay it without the delay of moral consideration. The staff came up, and the runic working he constructed in the 3 seconds before the Hulk crossed the crater's distance was not combat magic. It was a door, a boom tube variant, older than Apocalypse technology, the All-Father's own dimensional architecture, a working he had used precisely twice in his existence because its cost was significant even for him. The passage tore open behind him with blue-gold light and the smell of ozone and iron, and Odin stepped backward through it with the unhurried precision of a man catching a scheduled transport, his single eye holding the Hulk's gaze across the closing distance, with an expression that had evacuated everything except the cold arithmetic of survival. "This isn't finished," he said, to no one in particular, to all of them. To the 9 realms, perhaps, the way a man makes a statement to a room rather than a person. The gamma energy is still here. The rift is still open. And what came through it? His eye moved to Kratos, and the assessment in it was the specific kind that did not stop at physical threat, that went deeper, and that filed things away for 17 steps ahead calculations, not yet visible, is still useful. The door closed. The Hulk's fists hit the space where Odin had been standing. The ground did not survive the introduction. The crater that already existed doubled in diameter in a single impact, the shock wave rolling outward in a visible ring that stripped bark from trees and sent snow horizontal and hit Kratos, still in the tree line, already moving, like a wall. He planted his feet and leaned into it, and it pushed him back 2 steps before it spent itself. And when the air cleared, the Hulk was standing in the new crater, with both fists buried to the wrist in frozen Norse bedrock, and his chest heaving with the specific rhythm of a being experiencing something that the gamma physiology did not have an efficient mechanism for processing. Grief, not rage, or not only rage. The two were tangled in him the way they had always been tangled, inseparable by now, the fury and the sorrow so long intertwined that distinguishing them required an intimacy with his own interior architecture that the last hour's events had not been conducive to. But it was there, visible in the set of the massive shoulders and the downward angle of the green-eyed gaze, and the way the fists stayed in the earth rather than rising for the next strike. Not the posture of a being looking for something to destroy. The posture of a being that has run out of specific targets and is confronting, in the sudden absence of Odin's direction, and Odin's door, and Odin's convenient exit, the full weight of what the last hour had contained. Kratos walked into the crater. Atreus moved to follow. Kratos raised one hand without turning. Not a command, a request, the subtle distinction between them, something the boy had learned to read years ago. He stopped at the crater's edge. Mimir, hanging from Kratos' belt, went quiet with the instinct of a man who understood which moments required silence. The Hulk heard the footsteps. The green eyes rose from the destroyed earth and found Kratos crossing the crater floor toward him with the axe lowered. Not sheathed, not absent, but lowered, the specific position that was not surrender and not threat, but something that existed in the honest territory between them. His pace did not hurry, did not slow, the steady, deliberate approach of a man who had decided something and was committed to it past the point where the body's threat assessment instincts could reverse the decision. The Hulk straightened, pulled his fist from the bedrock. The fractured runes on his skin guttered and dim without the anchor and without the Allfather's supplementary working. Dying by degrees, their blue-gold light retreating, the Jotnar cold that the Leviathan axe had seeded in them, spreading through the broken script with patient, irresistible thoroughness. Banner was still at the surface, still holding, barely, the gamma tide running enormous beneath the reclaimed consciousness, the rage without ceiling that Odin's broken working had unleashed, still very much present, requiring everything Banner had to keep from the driver's seat. The open hands again, at his sides, that gesture, that impossible, costly, stubborn gesture, produced against the full weight of the biological and divine forces trying to close them. Kratos stopped 6 feet away. He looked at the open hands for a long moment, at the fractured runes, at the green eyes holding Banner's exhausted, horrified awareness above a body that was still the most destructive thing in the 9 realms and knew it. "You fought it the entire time," Kratos said, "even bound, even directed. You never stopped." The vast chest moved. The voice that came from it was Banner's voice running through Hulk's architecture. Wrong size container for the specific frequency, but recognizable, precise. The voice of a man who chose words carefully because words had always been the tool he had when everything else was taken from him. "I couldn't stop it. I could only slow it. Make it hesitate." A pause. "It wasn't enough." "You are standing here," Kratos said. "He is not." The green eyes registered this. They processed it with the rapid intelligence that had always been Banner's most essential characteristic. The ability to take in information under impossible conditions and extract its actual meaning rather than its apparent one. Odin had come, aimed, and fled. The anchor was destroyed. The harness was broken. The world tree stood unbroken to the north. These were the facts arranged in their correct order. "The boy," Banner said, looked past Kratos toward the crater's edge where Atreus stood. "He reached me. I didn't think—" He stopped. "Nobody talks to me. They talk to it. They study it, or they run from it, or they try to use it. Nobody talks to me." He is good at finding people, Kratos said, and the simplicity with which he said it contained more than the sentence could comfortably hold. The real fight began 30 seconds later. When not between them, within the Hulk, Banner holding the surface, holding control, and the unsealing gamma rage that Odin's broken working had unleashed, pressing upward with the patient geological force of something that had waited this long and was prepared to wait longer. The fractured runes were dying but slowly, and while they died, they continued to amplify, feeding the rage past its natural limits. And the natural limits were already not limits that any force in the Nine Realms was well positioned to contain. The Hulk's hands closed, not in anger, in the specific effort of a man gripping something that is trying to get away. Banner's face, visible in the eyes, always only in the eyes, showed the particular concentration of someone doing the hardest thing they had ever done, and doing it without assistance, without tools, with nothing but the practiced, lifelong stubbornness of a man who had been fighting himself since before the Gamma accident and would be fighting himself after it and had simply never stopped. I can't. The voice was losing coherence, Banner's precise articulation fraying at the edges as the tide rose. The runes are still, even broken. They're still feeding it. I need them gone. I need... Kratos was already moving. He had understood this from the moment Freya explained the harness. Broken was not gone, fractured was not finished, and the anchor's destruction had cracked the working, but not extinguished it. The remaining script on the Hulk's skin was still running on the residual energy of the shattered stone, diminishing but not diminished enough, not fast enough against the unsealing amplification the broken working had accidentally produced. The Jotnar cold of the Leviathan axe had shown its capacity to disrupt the runes on first contact. Full contact, deliberate, sustained, strategic contact, was a different proposition. He reached up and placed both hands on the Hulk's left shoulder, where the runes were densest. Not the axe, his hands, the ash-white scars and the divine strength, and the cold that Faye's weapon had left in his blood over years of use. He concentrated it, the way he had learned to concentrate things that live beneath the surface of his physiology. The deeper mechanics of his Spartan Olympian, godly construction that he still did not fully understand and used by instinct more than comprehension. The cold moved from his hands into the runes with the deliberate intentionality of something that had been invited rather than forced. The runes fractured further. The Hulk's entire body shuddered, a seismic, full-frame tremor that radiated through the frozen ground and would have thrown a lesser man backward. Kratos held on. The remaining script fought back with the last of the Allfather's embedded intelligence, probing his hands again for the old wounds, finding them, pressing into them with surgical precision. The memory of Ares, of Olympus, of ash and fire, and the worst morning of his life. He had made those wounds into armor. He pressed harder. Atreus saw it from the crater's edge and understood what it was costing. Not the physical toll, which was visible in the blood, in the rigid tension of his father's jaw, and the way the ground cracked beneath his feet from the combined forces being channeled. The other cost, the one that didn't show physically, the intimacy of the gesture, both hands, no weapon, trusting the thing in front of him not to destroy him during the 4 or 5 seconds of necessary vulnerability the contact required. Kratos did not trust easily. He trusted Banner. He trusted the open hands and the voice choosing its words carefully, and the consciousness that had pressed back against divine chains for an hour with nothing but stubbornness, that had reached back when Atreus offered contact, that had spent itself in bursts against the harness, not because there was any realistic chance of winning, but because stopping was not in its nature. He trusted the man who refused to become only the monster. The runes died. Not gradually, all at once. The last of the All-Father's working collapsing without the anchor's support and without the supplementary threads Odin had fled before completing. The blue-gold light going out across the Hulk's skin in a single wave that traveled shoulder to hand, to chest to everything else, and left only green. Only gamma. Only the Hulk's own biology, running its own equations, without divine input or divine direction. The unsealing amplification died with it. The rage was still there. It was always there. It would always be there. That was the permanent condition of being Bruce Banner. But it was his rage again. Earned, familiar, manageable in the specific way of something you have lived with long enough to understand its rhythms. When the tide dropped to its natural waterline, and Banner held the surface with the sudden ease of a man whose opponent has just removed half their weight. The green eyes blinked, looked at Kratos' hands on his shoulder, looked at the dead runes, looked at the destroyed forest, the twin craters, the Norse twilight settling into the early dark of a realm that kept different hours than any he had known, the stars in their alien configurations beginning to appear above the tree line. "It's over?" Banner's voice, fully his. The precise, exhausted articulation of a man who has been in an emergency for a very long time and is testing the concept of its absence. "The curse is over," Kratos said. He removed his hands, stepped back, studied the man in front of him with the directness that was his only mode of genuine engagement. "Artus, you remain." "I always remain." Banner looked at his own hands. Open, green, enormous, capable of what the last hour had demonstrated. The horror in his face was not new. It was the specific horror of a man who has looked at this particular evidence many times and has not found a way to stop finding it horrible. "I always have to stay and look at what it did, what I did. There's no—" He stopped, looked north, where Yggdrasil stood unbroken, looked at Atreus, making his way down into the crater. "The tree, I didn't—" "It stands," Kratos said. Banner exhaled. The sound of it was vast and ragged and contained more than relief. The specific sound of a man setting down something of tremendous weight and finding that his arms have forgotten what it feels like to not be carrying it. Above them, in the alien Norse sky, Odin's ravens circled once and turned south. And somewhere in the Allfather's high seat, 17 steps ahead, the next calculation had already begun. The Lake of Nine was quiet when they reached it. Not the aggressive, loaded quiet of before, not the silence of a forest that had run out of living things to make noise. The quieter quiet of aftermath, of a landscape reassembling its dignity after catastrophe, the particular stillness that settles over a place when the thing that was going to happen has happened, and the place is deciding what it is now. Snow had begun to fall. Real snow, not the horizontal violence of displaced air from gamma shock waves, but the slow, considered descent of actual weather. Each flake arriving with the unhurried indifference of a natural world that had noted the last hour's events and filed them under the long category of things gods and monsters had done to Midgard, and continued falling anyway. Kratos built the fire. It was not a gesture he was known for. The domestic mechanics of survival, fire, food, shelter, the maintenance of a life between its violent interruptions, had come to him late, acquired in the same slow reconstruction that had brought him north and given him a son, and taught him, against every instinct his Spartan upbringing had installed, that the spaces between catastrophes were not merely recovery time. They were the point. The fire caught in the stone ring outside the lodge with the cooperative efficiency of dry wood in capable hands. When its light pushed the Norse dark back to a respectful distance and painted the surrounding snow in amber. Banner sat across from it with his knees drawn up and his arms resting on them and his eyes on the flames with the specific quality of attention a man gives a fire when he is not actually watching the fire. He had diminished during the walk. Not in the way of weakness. The gamma biology did not permit conventional diminishment, the Hulk's form persisting through circumstances that would have reduced anything else. But the urgency that had maintained the massive frame through the last hour's sustained crisis had eased, and Banner had begun the gradual negotiation toward something smaller, the green receding by degrees in the way of a tide that has no objection to going out when nothing is requiring it to stay in. By the time they reached the lodge, he was closer to Banner than Hulk. Still green-tinged, still larger than any human had a biological right to be, but recognizably a man, sitting in the firelight, with the exhausted clarity of someone who had just come through something and was taking careful inventory of what remained. Atreus had not stopped talking. Not anxiously. The boy had inherited enough of his father to understand the difference between filling silence and populating it purposefully. He talked about the 9 realms with the enthusiastic precision of someone sharing a world they loved, with someone encountering it fresh. Yggdrasil's architecture, the specific character of each realm, the dwarven craft of Nidavellir, the politics of the Vanir. Atreus explaining and Banner listening with the focused attention of a scientist encountering a cosmological framework that had no overlap with any physics he had been educated in, and finding it, despite everything, genuinely fascinating. Mimir contributed from the post he had been hung on beside the fire with his characteristic mixture of ancient knowledge and pointed commentary. Freya sat at the lodge's threshold, not inside, not entirely outside, occupying the careful intermediate position of a woman who had not yet decided how much belonging this place was owed. She watched Banner with an expression that had worked its way through several iterations across the walk back. The initial warrior's assessment, the Vanir goddess's recognition of gamma energy as a magical anomaly, and something that had settled eventually into the quieter observation of a mother who understood, with the specific expertise of centuries, what it looked like when a person was reconstructing themselves after violence. Kratos sat across the fire from Banner and said nothing. This was not unusual. It was in many ways his primary mode of contribution to any gathering. The particular quality of his silence, that was not absence but presence, not detachment, but the specific form of attention that does not require vocalization to be felt. He had said what needed saying in the crater. The rest could be fire and falling snow, and the boy's voice mapping a cosmos for a stranger. Banner spoke eventually, the scientist first. Questions about Yggdrasil's energy signature, about the rift that had brought him here. Precise and technical and revealing in their precision, the mind that had built the gamma apparatus in the first place. Mimir answered with the breadth of a man who had spent centuries at the intersection of the mystical and the practical, and the conversation between them developed with the rapid ease of two intelligences that had found their operating frequency. Then Banner went quiet for a while, and the fire worked and the snow fell. "He'll try again," he said finally. Not a question. His eyes had not left the flames. "He always tries again," Mimir said. "It is the All-Father's most exhausting quality. You have now personally experienced what the rest of us have been managing for centuries. Welcome." "The rift," Banner said. "The one I came through. It's still open?" "Aye," Mimir said, and his voice carried something careful. "High, which means the gamma energy is still leaking from your universe into this one, in trace quantities. Enough for Odin's scholars to study, to attempt another working. Not enough for—" He paused. "Not enough for him to use without another vessel?" The implication settled around the fire. Banner looked at his hands. The green had faded further, the firelight finding more of the human undertones in his skin now, the specific color of a man whose biology ran on extraordinary processes, but was, at its foundation, still human. Still Bruce. The hands that had helped build the gamma apparatus, that had spent years attempting to undo what that apparatus had done, that had pressed against the inside of his own skull for an hour in a realm he had no name for, and refused to stop pressing. "I can't go back," he said. "Not yet. In the rift, the transit destabilized something. Mimir explained it on the way here. If I attempt to force a return through an unstable breach, the gamma surge could—" He stopped. "It would be bad, for this side and mine. You are aware," Kratos said, "that the All-Father will attempt to use you again." "I'm aware." Banner's voice was even. "I'm also aware that I've been used before, by people smarter than Odin, who had better tools and longer lead time." He looked up from the fire, and the eyes that met Kratos's across the flames were tired and certain in equal measure. "It doesn't get easier, but I know what it feels like now. The harness, the directed rage. I know the texture of it, the specific way it tries to push Banner down." He paused. "That knowledge is a defense. Not a complete one, but a defense." Kratos regarded him. "Well, you have fought this, the thing inside you, for a long time. My whole adult life. And you have not destroyed yourself with it. Not for lack of trying." The ghost of something that was not quite a smile crossed Banner's face. The expression of a man who has made peace with his own dark comedy, who has earned the right to find the absurdity in his own suffering through the specific process of surviving it. "The Hulk is He's not separate from me. I spent years trying to think of him that way. It was easier. It made it easier to deal with the gap between who I want to be and what I can do. He looked back at the fire. But he's grief. He's the part of me that was a scared kid with a violent father and no defense and too much mind and no body to match it. He's everything that needed to be enormous because smallness was a death sentence. A pause. And somewhere in there, he is also, genuinely, actually, the strongest there is, which is its own complicated thing to carry. The fire moved. The snow fell. Atreus was very still across the fire, listening with the quality of attention that was his best and most consistent gift. The capacity to receive without filtering, to let what was being said arrive at its actual weight rather than the weight he had preassigned it. Kratos looked at the flames. "My rage," he said, and the two words landed in the firelit quiet with the specific weight of words that have been carried a long distance before being set down. "Killed my family." He did not elaborate. He did not frame it. He placed it in the air between them and left it there with the directness of a man who had learned, very late, that some truths required no architecture. "I wore their ashes for years. I believed it was penance. It was also, I understand now, refusal. To let them be gone. To accept that the thing I had been made into had cost something irreplaceable." Banner said nothing. "I did not stop being dangerous," Kratos continued. "I did not stop being the thing that was made by gods to destroy. I learned, slowly at great cost, through this." He did not gesture at Atreus, but the word carried him regardless. That the weapon could choose its targets. That choosing was not weakness. That control was not the absence of power, but its highest expression. He looked at Banner. "You know this already." "I know it some days," Banner said. "10 other days I forget." "Then you remember again. And on the days I forget, you have people who remember for you," Atreus said quietly from across the fire, and did not look away when both men looked at him. The rift above the northern crater still glowed faintly in the direction of the Lake of Nine, visible from the lodge's threshold as a distant luminescence against the Norse dark, the gamma green of another universe bleeding through a wound in the fabric of this one. Freya watched it from the threshold with her arms crossed and her expression working through its final iteration of the evening. "The rift needs to be closed," she said. "Properly closed, before Odin sends scholars to the site to harvest what remains." She glanced at Banner. "Can you close it from this side?" "I don't know," Banner said honestly. I know what opened it. I know the energy signature. I need time and information I don't currently have." He paused. "But I can learn. Given access to the right people, the right resources." "I know people," Mimir said, with the specific confidence of a man whose primary asset had always been the breadth of his acquaintance. "Dwarven smiths whose understanding of energy and craft exceeds anything your scholars have produced. Broken Sindri have forgotten more about energy manipulation than most gods ever knew." "Then we start there," Banner said. He said "we" without apparent awareness that he had said it. The naturalness of its arrival, the unself-conscious inclusion of himself in the collaborative framework of the problem, was more revealing than any deliberate statement would have been. The scientist defaulting to the first-person plural. The man who had spent years being singular finding, in this alien realm with its alien fire and its falling alien snow, the reflexive grammar of belonging. Kratos noted it, filed it, decided with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to make important decisions without announcing them, that it mattered. Later, when the fire had settled to embers and Atreus had finally succumbed to the sleep he had been resisting for an hour, and Freya had retreated into the Midgard night on whatever private errand her evenings contained, Mimir hung in his post and watched Banner sitting with his back against the lodge wall and his eyes on the rift glow to the north. "You are thinking about what he said," Mimir observed. "About remembering." "I'm thinking about a lot of things." "I watch, so you're that kind of man." Mimir was quiet for a moment. "For what it is worth, and I say this as someone who has spent centuries observing what gods and monsters do to each other in this particular cosmos, what you did today, fighting that harness from inside it for an hour with nothing but stubbornness and refusal, is not nothing, is not small. There are gods in these realms who have faced Odin's workings and folded in minutes. I didn't win, Banner said. Kratos broke the anchor. Atreus reached me. You held, Mimir said. The rest was possible because you held. Banner looked at his hands again. The habit of the guilty, of the responsible, of the man who measures himself by what his hands have done and will do, and is never quite finished with the accounting. Then slowly he closed them and let them rest. The fire exhaled its last warmth. Somewhere in the northern dark, beyond the rift's fading glow, in Odin's retreating ravens, in the frost-edged silence of a Midgard that was deciding what it was now, the nine realms continued their slow revolution around the axis of the world tree that still stood. Yggdrasil, unbroken, its roots intact, its branches carrying the weight of nine worlds and one small cosmic accident that had crashed into the wrong realm at the wrong time, and found against all reasonable expectation exactly the right people. The rift pulsed once in the northern dark, still open, still bleeding green, and in the Allfather's high seat, where all of creation was visible to a single ancient eye, one Odin sat with the patience of a being who had been planning across centuries and found 17 steps ahead, merely the beginning of the count, turning over what he had learned today about gamma energy and the specific texture of Bruce Banner's stubbornness and the God of War's particular capacity for trust, and added it to the calculations already in motion. The next move was already being made. It was always already being made. Two weapons of the gods sat in the firelight of a Norse lodge as the embers died. One had been forged in Spartan blood and Olympian cruelty, and had spent decades learning that the instrument did not have to become the music it was written to play. The other had been built in a gamma laboratory in a childhood of survival, and was still, after everything, in the middle of that same learning. Well, they had stopped Odin's gambit. The world tree stood. The curse was broken. The anchor was dust in Helheim. It was not a victory in the comprehensive sense. Odin did not suffer comprehensive defeats. He suffered redirections, recalibrations, the temporary interruption of plans that immediately became new plans with the additional data of what had gone wrong incorporated. The rift still breathed. The raven still watched. The Allfather's 17 steps ahead contained at least one that neither Kratos nor Banner, nor Mimir nor Freya had yet seen. But today the harness had broken. Today Banner had held. Today Atreus had reached through divine interference and gamma radiation, and centuries of accumulated suffering, and found a person worth reaching. The snow fell on the nine realms without opinion. The rift glowed north. So the god of war and the man who carried the strongest force on earth sat with the cooling fire between them, two monsters who had chosen their targets, and waited for what the Allfather's next move would require of them. It would come. It always came. They would be ready. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. More stories await.